Okay, let's unpack this. It's maybe one of the most fundamental questions you could ask. Really, when you look at history at faith,
Hmm.
did Jesus Christ actually, live? Was he a real person in history, or is the whole story we know?
Hmm.
Well, is it myth?
It's a massive question, and it's sparked, gosh, centuries of intense debate, hasn't it? The stakes feel incredibly high. I mean, his life, or the idea of it, has shaped, what, 2,000 years of civilization? Yet that skepticism,
Huh?
it's still there.
Oh, absolutely. And that deep foundational question is exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at the book Jesus Christ, Messiah or Myth, an exploratory analytical assessment by Dr. Samuel Inbaraja
All
S.
right, Dr. Imbaraja. And he brings a really interesting perspective, actually. He's a medical doctor, a radiologist, which you might not
Yeah,
expect.
radiologist, huh?
Yeah, but he also holds a certificate in Christian apologetics from Biola University, which is, a pretty well-known place for studying and defending Christian beliefs. And he puts serious time into this. About 10 years, the book says, researching it.
10 years. Wow. That's more than just a casual interest. What was it that really pushed him to spend a decade digging into this specifically?
Well, he mentions being genuinely perplexed, I guess, by claims skeptics made about Jesus when he was back in college. He felt their arguments weren't just, different viewpoints, but had actual serious flaws you could point to.
Sure.
So he basically set out to do his own assessment, a really thorough one, pulling from historical sources, archaeological findings, religious texts, really trying to engage directly with those skeptical ideas.
Got it. So our mission here in this deep dive is really to follow his lead on that, to unpack the key arguments, look at the evidence he presents. We want to understand how he tackles this whole debate about the historical Jesus and, the claims from people who doubt he existed, hopefully giving you, the listener, a clearer picture of the basis for his conclusions.
Exactly. It's about seeing what kind of evidence, what kind of reasoning gets brought to the table on such a critical historical question.
All right, let's jump right in then. The people who argue Jesus didn't exist as a real historical figure, they're often called Jesus mythicists, right?
Is the term, yeah. Their core position is either, flat out denial that he existed, or at least expressing really serious doubt because they feel there isn't enough solid proof.
Okay.
And one of the first points the research brings up is just how different the Jesus narrative feels from, say, typical mythology. It's packed with all these specific details that seem to ground it in history.
Like what kind of details?
Well, think about Luke, who wrote the third gospel. There's this English archaeologist, Sir William Ramsay. He spent years analyzing Luke's writings, really scrutinizing the details.
Ramsey, right? I've heard of his work.
And Ramsay concluded Luke was a historian of, quote, first strength. Just incredibly accurate about places, titles, the whole context.
That's quite an endorsement, especially from a professional archaeologist.
Yeah.
And the New Testament records themselves claim to be history, right? They put events in very specific, potentially verifiable settings.
They absolutely do. But, as the analysis points out, skeptics often come at these texts with something called an anti-supernatural bias.
Explain that a bit. What does that mean in practice?
It's a really key idea here. This bias basically means rejecting anything supernatural, like right from the start, before even really looking at the evidence for it in its own context.
So if an account mentions a miracle or, something divine,
It gets dismissed, not because the evidence within the story is necessarily weak, but just because it contains something that bias deems impossible from the outset.
right, if your starting point is the supernatural can't happen, period, then any historical account that includes it is automatically going to be rejected or, I guess, reinterpreted to strip those elements out.
Precisely, and this bias has really heavily influenced the whole academic search for the historical Jesus. You often hear it discussed in terms of different quests.
Ah, yes, the quests.
Yeah, the research traces this through what's called the first quest. This popped up around the 17th, 18th centuries, and it was really driven by rationalism.
Okay, rationalism. So reason above all else.
Pretty much. Anything supernatural in the Gospels was just considered untrue because, well, you couldn't explain it naturally or logically according to their framework.
So for some of them, the goal was almost to, debunk the Gospels, seeing them as maybe deliberate lies or just wildly inaccurate stories.
That was definitely part of it for some. You had figures like Herman Samuel Ramirez. His conclusion was basically Jesus was just a human guy, a messiah trying to free people from Roman rule politically. And when he got crucified, well, the disciples just made up the resurrection story and stole his body.
Which is interesting because isn't that the exact explanation the Jewish leaders tried to spread, according to Matthew's gospel itself?
It is. which is quite telling. But importantly, almost all scholars today, even very critical ones, reject the main conclusions of that first quest. They recognize that a purely rationalistic framework has limits when you're assessing things like miracle claims. You can't just dismiss the possibility before you even weigh the evidence being presented.
Okay, so the first quest, very skeptical,
Mhm.
rooted in that kind of rationalism. Where did the second quest go from there?
The second quest was really shaped by existentialism. You hear names like Rudolf Bultmann, a hugely influential German theologian, though also pretty controversial.
Well, Boltman, right, demythologized.
Exactly, that was his big thing. This quest also largely rejected the supernatural, the miracles. Their starting point was that the Jesus of history, the actual man who lived, was fundamentally different from the Jesus of faith worshipped by Christians.
So they saw the Gospels more as theological documents created by the early church, maybe, not historical reports from people who were actually there.
That was the core idea, yes. This view suggested that a lot of the gospel tradition wasn't actually from Jesus himself, but was created, or at least heavily shaped, by those early Christian communities looking back later.
Okay.
And because they started with that kind of existential, anti-supernatural view, it's maybe not surprising they stayed pretty skeptical about the Gospels being reliable historical sources for Jesus's actual life and actions.
So then we get to the third quest. Did things shift again? Was there a different approach?
Oh, significantly. The third quest, which includes scholars like Geza Vermes, even groups like the Jesus Seminar, though they had their own sometimes controversial methods,
Right, the ones voting on sayings with beads.
that's them. But the broader third quest movement started putting Jesus firmly back into his original world. Second Temple Judaism under Roman occupation in first century Palestine.
So really emphasizing Jesus as a Jewish man, operating within that very specific historical and religious environment.
Precisely. This quest tended to see Jesus primarily as an eschatological prophet, someone preaching about the end times, God's judgment, fitting into a tradition like John the Baptist. Vermes, for instance, identified Jesus as a Jewish Hasid.
A Hasid, like a holy man.
Yeah, a kind of charismatic figure known within Jewish tradition for healings and maybe miracles, someone operating within that Jewish framework.
And importantly, the third quest started seeing more continuity, right,
Mhm.
between Jesus and the early church movement that followed him. They could kind of trace a line from John the Baptist through Jesus to figures like Paul.
Yes, seeing them as part of a related stream of prophetic or maybe reform movements within Judaism. And critically, during this era, scholars became generally more open to trusting the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, seeing them more as historical writings, though some were still a bit hesitant about John's Gospel.
Why hesitant about John?
It was often seen as much more overtly theological, maybe less focused on strict historical narrative than the others. But even then, research highlighted how these texts, the Gospels, combine elements of, say, Greco-Roman biography with Jewish ways of recording history.
Which suggests they weren't just making stuff up. They were using recognizable literary forms from their time to record what happened and explain why this person was significant.
Exactly. They were adapting biographical styles, maybe like Plutarch's Lives, but using them to portray Jesus within his Jewish context and also as the Messiah they believed him to be. Ancient biographies weren't like modern ones focused on psychology, you know?
Right.
They aimed to show the significance of a person's public life, how they embodied certain important virtues or fulfilled a certain role. Mark's Gospel, for example, fits that ancient biographical mold quite well.
Okay, so the scholarly consensus has definitely shifted over time. The third quest moves towards a stronger affirmation of Jesus being a real historical figure within his specific Jewish world.
Yeah.
But let's pivot to the claims inside the New Testament texts themselves. The analysis really emphasizes that the gospel writers explicitly say they're recording history.
Oh, they absolutely do. Luke, especially, he goes to incredible lengths, really, to anchor his account in specific, verifiable historical details.
Like what?
Well, in the beginning of his gospel, he names the Roman emperor, Tiberius Caesar. He names the governor, Pontius Pilate. He names the local rulers, Herod, Philip, Lysanias, these tetrarchs, and the high priests, Annas and Caiaphas.
Wow, that's specific.
And he dates John the Baptist's ministry precisely, the 15th year of Tiberius's reign, which, when you account for how co-regencies worked back then, lines up historically with about AD 26.
That level of detail about known historical figures, political structures, naming rulers right down to the regional level. That just feels very different from how myths usually sound, doesn't it?
It really does. And then you have the book of Acts, also attributed to Luke, stating that these things concerning Jesus were not done in a corner. The implication is clear. These were public events, witnessed by lots of people.
And the apostles themselves.
They constantly claim to be eyewitnesses. John, in his first letter, says he's proclaiming what he heard, what he'd seen with his eyes, what he'd looked at, and even touched with his hands. It's very physical, very direct.
And Peter, too. I remember in his second letter, he's very blunt. He says something like, we weren't following cleverly devised stories or myths, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty.
Exactly. These are strong internal claims to reality, to historicity. They deliberately place Jesus' life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection within a specific time and place, Palestine, under Roman rule, involving real rulers and religious leaders we know about from other non-biblical history.
Okay, but let's tackle that big skeptical argument head on. The miracles. The idea that just including miracles automatically invalidates the Gospels, his history. Skeptics often say, miracles violate the immutable laws of nature, so they must be myths.
Right, and this is where the book brings in someone really interesting, Simon Greenleaf. He was a famous Harvard law professor and expert on the rules of legal evidence.
A legal expert weighing in on miracles.
Yeah, and Greenleaf directly challenged that core assumption that miracles are impossible because they violate natural laws. He argued that this very assumption is kind of the bedrock of an atheistic system. It implies that even God himself, if he exists, is bound by these natural laws we observe. But Greenleaf asks, wait a minute, who made these laws? Where do they get their power? It's like saying the architect is trapped inside the building they designed.
That's a good analogy.
And he pushed back against the idea, often linked to the philosopher David Hume, that we can only reason based on uniform human experience. Greenleaf said, well, that view basically shuts the door on any knowledge we get through inference or deduction. It kind of precludes believing in God, who by definition would be omnipotent and could potentially use other laws or principles we don't even know about to change things.
So just because miracles aren't part of our normal everyday experience doesn't automatically prove they're impossible, or that they didn't happen if you have, say, strong witness testimony.
The research uses a neat analogy. Think about humans overcoming gravity. Gravity is a natural law, right? But we figured out aerodynamics, other principles, and now we can fly. Couldn't a being with infinitely greater knowledge use principles totally unknown to us to do things we'd see as miracles?
That reframes it, doesn't it? Not as breaking laws, but maybe operating by a deeper set we just don't understand?
Exactly. It shifts the focus from just rejecting it out of hand to actually considering the possibility, especially if there's evidence presented.
Okay. What else did Greenleaf point out?
He also commented on the characters in the Gospels, how strikingly natural and complex they are. He said that's something you rarely find done well in fiction, especially across multiple accounts. He uses Peter as a prime example.
Peter. How so?
Think about him. He's impulsive, right? Zealous, but also sometimes really humble. Courageous 1 minute.
Like cutting off the guard's ear?
Yeah. And then just hours later, totally falling apart and denying he even knows Jesus 3 times because he's scared.
That does feel very
Yeah.
human. Very real. Full of contradictions.
It really does. And Greenleaf's point was that you have 4 different writers depicting this complex, believable, consistent character. That suggests it wasn't just made up. Plus, think about all the unflattering details the gospel writers include about themselves and the other disciples.
Oh, right. Their misunderstandings, their squabbles, their failures, running away when Jesus gets arrested.
Yes. That's often called the criterion of embarrassment. Why on earth would you invent details that make your own core group or even yourself look foolish, weak, or cowardly if you were just trying to cook up a convincing story to promote yourselves?
Good point. It makes them look bad.
Exactly. Including those embarrassing bits strongly suggests they felt bound to tell the truth, to just record what actually happened, warts and all, including their own failings. Greenleaf, who apparently started out wanting to disprove the resurrection using legal analysis.
Wait, he started out skeptical.
That's the story, yeah. He concluded, based on this kind of internal evidence, the consistency, the complexity, the embarrassing details, that the gospel witnesses were actually reliable.
Wow. That's quite a turnaround, coming from a legal scholar focused purely on evidence.
It really underscores the strength of the internal testimony when looked at through that lens. Now let's switch gears a bit to another challenge you often hear from skeptics: the Gnostic Gospels.
Ah, yes, things like the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Sometimes people present these as, like, alternative, maybe even more authentic versions of Jesus' story.
The research makes a very clear distinction between these Gnostic texts and the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. First off, Gnostic theology is fundamentally different. It's all about secret knowledge gnosis supposedly given by Jesus only to a few special disciples. That idea is pretty much absent from the canonical Gospels.
Right, the canonical Gospels seem much more public in their message.
Yeah.
And aren't the Gnostic Gospels generally considered much later?
That's the other critical point. They seem to reflect philosophical ideas from the 2nd century, maybe even later, not the 1st century Jewish world where Jesus actually lived and taught.
So they're detached from that historical context.
Very much so. They lack the deep connections to the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament prophecies, the whole messianic expectation that's absolutely central to understanding the Jesus portrayed in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Whereas the canonical Gospels are constantly referencing Jewish scripture, presenting Jesus as the fulfillment of those prophecies.
Exactly. And they maintain that strong narrative grounding in the actual history and culture of 1st century Palestine. The Gnostic texts often feel more, well, philosophical, abstract. They were definitely composed later, they reflect a different worldview, and they often contain stuff that seems like later embellishment.
Embellishments, like what kind of things?
The Gospel of Peter is mentioned as one example. It apparently has these really wild, fantastical descriptions of the resurrection, much more exaggerated than the accounts in the canonical Gospels, especially Mark's, which is quite stark and restrained.
Right.
And that comparative lack of sort of legendary development or over-the-top embellishment in the canonical text is seen as another mark of their greater historical reliability.
So, the Gnostic Gospels are viewed as different and less historically reliable, not just because their theology is different, but because they seem to lack that historical anchor, that eyewitness feel. And they appear to be later interpretations influenced by different philosophies.
Yeah, they really belong to a separate stream of thought that developed well after the apostles. The research also touches on why we have 4 canonical Gospels. The view presented isn't that they contradict each other, but that they're like variations on the same core story, maybe tailored for different audiences.
Different audiences.
Right, like Matthew seems primarily aimed at a Jewish audience, showing Jesus as the promised Messiah king. Mark is maybe more for a general, perhaps Roman or Gentile audience, fast-paced, focused on action. Luke writes perhaps for a broader Greco-Roman readership, presenting a more detailed, orderly account. And John, well, John is definitely more theological, focusing on Jesus' divine identity as the Son of God.
So each gives a unique angle, a complementary perspective on the same historical person and events, written with specific readers in mind.
Exactly. They supplement each other without really undermining the basic historical narrative, which is presented as rooted in eyewitness testimony, historical context, and that Jewish theological background.
Okay, so that covers the internal evidence within the New Testament and addresses some big challenges like the Gnostic texts and the whole issue of miracles. What about evidence from outside the Bible? Are there non-Christian sources that mention Jesus or his followers?
Ah, yes. This is where you get some really crucial corroboration, often from what are called hostile witnesses. These are Jewish and Roman writers who were definitely not Christians. They might even have been critical, but they still wrote about Jesus and the early Christians.
Okay, who are the main ones we should know about?
Tacitus is a big one, a very respected Roman senator and historian writing in the early 2nd century. In his annals, he's describing Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians in Rome after the Great Fire.
Right, Nero blaming the Christians.
Exactly. And in that context, Tacitus mentions the founder of this group, this movement. He calls him Christus, Christ, and says he was executed by the governor, Pontius Pilate, during the reign of Tiberius.
Wow. So a Roman historian, writing about something else entirely, directly links Jesus' death to a known Roman governor, Pilate, during a specific emperor's reign. That matches the New Testament timeline perfectly.
It's a precise historical detail aligning exactly with the gospel accounts, and it comes from a completely independent, non-Christian source.
Okay, who else? What about Jewish sources? You mentioned Josephus earlier.
Flavius Josephus, yes.
Yes.
He was a Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience towards the end of the 1st century. He also mentions Jesus in his major work, Jewish Antiquities. There's one passage where he's talking about the execution of James.
James, Jesus' brother.
Yes. And Josephus explicitly identifies him as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ or Messiah.
Wait, Josephus, who wasn't a Christian, refers to Jesus as the one called the Christ.
That's what the text says, yes. The brother of Jesus, the one called Christ. This reference comes up almost incidentally while discussing James's illegal execution by the Jewish high priest. It doesn't feel like something shoehorned in later by a Christian copyist. It feels like Josephus is just identifying which James he means. And given Josephus knew first century Palestine inside out, his references are considered pretty significant.
So let me get this straight. You have Tacitus, a Roman historian, and Josephus, a Jewish historian, writing independently. Neither of them Christian. One arguably hostile in the context of persecution, and both confirm the historical existence of Jesus, his execution under Pontius Pilate, and the fact that he had followers who continued his movement after his death.
That's the core testimony from those sources, yes. And crucially, the research points out none of the known ancient critics of Christianity from that era, Roman or Jewish, ever seemed to deny that Jesus existed.
They complained about Christians, but not about whether Jesus was real.
Exactly. Their criticisms were about the spread of this new religion, the beliefs of its followers, maybe their refusal to worship the emperor, their perceived superstition, as Tacitus called it. Tacitus himself notes the movement spreading from Judea all the way to Rome, calling it a mischief. Josephus acknowledges the Christian movement persisted despite opposition. But nobody seems to have said, this whole thing is based on a guy who never even lived.
That's actually a really powerful point. Ancient critics engaged with Christianity, sometimes fiercely, but they didn't use the argument Jesus never existed, which is something you do hear from some modern skeptics.
Right. And the research argues that this consistent lack of denial from ancient sources, including those who were clearly critical or hostile towards Christianity, adds significant weight to the historical case for Jesus' existence.
What about other kinds of evidence, like archaeology, or manuscript evidence for the New Testament itself?
Absolutely crucial. The discovery of early New Testament manuscripts is key. We have fragments like the John Rylands Papyrus, P52. It's a tiny piece, but it contains verses from John's Gospel, and it's dated paleographically to the first half of the 2nd century, maybe as early as AD 125.
AD 125. For a piece of John's Gospel, that's incredibly early. That would put it really close to when John was traditionally thought to have written it, late in the 1st century. It certainly pushes back against any idea that John's Gospel was some late 3rd century invention.
It makes that very difficult to argue, yes. And you have other important early manuscript collections like the Chester Beatty Papyri, the Bodmer Papyri. These provide evidence for many New Testament books circulating by the 3rd century or even into the 2nd. These finds confirm that these specific texts we have today were being copied and spread widely relatively early on. They support the antiquity of the documents.
And the research also mentioned details within the Gospels, like descriptions of the temple in Jerusalem.
Yes. The Gospels contain detailed and seemingly accurate descriptions of the temple complex and its rituals. The temple was completely destroyed by the Romans in AD 70.
Right.
The argument is that it would have been very difficult for someone writing much later, after AD 70, especially after Jerusalem itself was largely destroyed and rebuilt differently, to get those specific details about the temple layout and practices correct without relying on eyewitness accounts or very early sources written before the destruction.
Okay. So when you pull all these threads together, the internal claims within the Gospels to be history, the specific historical details that seem to be corroborated by archaeology, like Ramsey's work on Luke, the consistent testimony from non-Christian, even hostile sources like Tacitus and Josephus, the early manuscript evidence we have, and the accurate descriptions of the historical setting like the temple before its destruction, it really does build quite a layered case for the historical Jesus, doesn't it? Based on this assessment, anyway.
That's the perspective presented, yes, that the historical evidence, when looked at critically but also perhaps with an open mind towards the possibility of the events described, provides a really compelling foundation. You have this chain of transmission, too, from Jesus to the apostles, who taught disciples, who taught the early church fathers, all affirming the same core message and the content of these New Testament documents. Evidence from all of these different angles seems to point towards the traditional view that Christianity is rooted in a real historical person and real historical events.
Wow, yeah. That was a very thorough journey through the arguments laid out in Dr. Imbraj's book. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We really have.
From understanding those different scholarly quests for the historical Jesus and how the approaches evolved, to digging into that anti-supernatural bias and how it affects evaluating miracle claims, then contrasting the canonical Gospels with the later Gnostic ones, and finally looking at that really compelling external evidence from ancient Roman and Jewish historians, plus the manuscript finds.
And I think the core takeaway from this assessment, the book's main argument, is that if you really do a careful evaluation, looking at the historical evidence we have, using sound scholarly methods. Considering the internal characteristics of the texts themselves, it strongly supports both the historical existence of Jesus and the general reliability of those canonical gospel accounts. It pushes back pretty hard against skeptical positions that often seem to start with unproven philosophical assumptions, like just deciding beforehand that miracles are impossible.
It definitely gives you a much deeper appreciation for the different kinds of evidence involved in this debate. It's not just about faith versus skepticism. It's about looking at ancient biography, historical context, textual criticism, the testimony of outsiders. It's complex.
Absolutely. It's certainly not a simple question with easy answers, but the research we've discussed provides, I think, a really solid framework for how you might evaluate the claims being made.
It really does give you a lot to think about regarding the foundations of these historical claims, and for many, their faith claims too.
Indeed. And maybe that leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to consider. If ancient sources, even ones that had no reason to promote Christianity, think Tacitus, the Roman historian, Josephus, the Jewish historian, if they confirm the historical reality of Jesus' existence, and they also noted the rapid, seemingly unstoppable spread of his followers, even in the face of intense opposition, what might that tell us about the sheer impact of his life, about the nature of the movement that he started? Something to mull over.